recognize that this is not freedom, and you want to be free, it seems to me the only logical position you can take is to dismantle and abolish. What do you say?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the case for abolition. I think the way I see it, the people that are looking for transitional steps, I'm talking about the steps that actually, I think, do move in the direction of liberty. There's sometimes they're called what I regard as false steps, presented as steps toward it, but I don't think would be. But in the case of the ones that actually would move in that direction, in a way, those people are cooperating with us. It's like we're setting the direction, and now other people working for various think tanks and pundits who are writing articles are now seeing that direction. Now are trying to propose ways to get there. So it seems to be it's a subconscious or unconscious cooperation. It's like economics people are cooperating without realizing they're cooperating. So I think that works that way. Because there's two things. There's advocating what you think ought to be done, properly ought to be done, and you cover that. Then there's also, you need a theory of social change, and things tend not to change all at once. That doesn't mean we don't want it to, but it's most likely not just going to disappear. Because, think about it for a second. You said, look, get rid of Social Security, Medicare, and public school. In order for that to happen, that would have to be preceded by a huge change in people's thinking. Otherwise, why would those things just be abolished? So, while you aim at that, you also realize you got to change people's minds about things, because I just don't see what's the pathway to getting from here to the day when everyone agrees that it will be abolished. So I see the two working together. Take somebody like Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman spent his life pushing for second best solutions. Now I'm Milton Friedman, so I don't know if that meant he really believed ever could ever be achieved, or whether he thought maybe it could be achieved, but if it's going to be achieved, it's going to be achieved by incremental steps. So he chose to spend his life working on the incremental steps. And I think he did a lot of good things, and he taught a lot of people about free markets. So we certainly don't want to say that his life was misspent. He taught lots of people about the free market. He helped get rid of the draft. Talk about abolition. He helped get rid of the draft. So anyway, that's how I would approach that.
Well, I don't know. I might take issue with that. I think Friedman may have wasted part of his life. In fact, it's interesting you bring up Friedman, because on this very issue, Friedman, when FFF first got started in 1989, I wrote an article criticizing vouchers in the very first year of publication of our journal, Future of Freedom. And it was in the September or August issue of 1990. And Friedman was on our complimentary mailing list. And lo and behold, he was on his way to a speech when he obviously got the thing in the mail. This is pre-internet days, obviously, so he got the print copy. So he goes to the speech, and he makes reference to Jacob Hornberger at the Future of Freedom Foundation. And I just started this thing. It's like, oh my gosh, a Nobel laureate economist is criticizing me. And he says, look what Hornberger says. He compliments FFF. He says, this is an organization that's doing good work and is having an impact. But he says, am I a socialist because I advocate vouchers? And he said the point. He said that, he says, what does Hornberger say? Hornberger says the answer is freedom. He says, of course that's the answer, but how do you get from here to there? Well, you kind of implied this, that there are instances where the method chosen doesn't get you from here to there. And I think vouchers is the perfect example of that. I think it entrenches the state. That here private schools start receiving the vouchers, their budget starts getting based on it. What's the likelihood that they're going to say, well, okay, we favor no more vouchers? So you build up this huge bureaucracy in this thing. And not only that, but our task of showing the goal line of what we want to accomplish, the arguments are really different from, the voucher proponent can say, well, we're going to, just give choice to people. We are arguing a total separation of government and the state. And that's a tough task. Or take immigration. We call for totally open borders. Open the borders, free movements of people, goods, and services. Compare that to the guys that say, well, we want to open up the borders and let in more immigrants. well, that seems a little bit safer, you know, for people. The bureaucracy stays, but it still remains central planning. So I think we have to continue with shooting for the goal.
Oh, yeah, what I actually said was that we can have both. In other words, we're doing what we want to do, but there are other people out there who are interested in doing coming up with the incremental steps. And my objection to vouchers, if I can read for a second, my objection to vouchers is not that I oppose all incremental steps, no matter what they are. It's that I don't believe that's an incremental step toward ridding ourselves of government provided and financed education. So I'm making a distinction. I don't oppose vouchers because I'm in principle opposed to partway steps. A partway step that I really thought was moving in the direction I want to go, I would say, fine. I'm still working for the final goal, but if somebody's proposing, let's say, a 50% cut of the income tax, I'm certainly not going to oppose it because it wasn't proposing to abolish the income tax. So my opposition to vouchers is because I don't think vouchers, for reasons you just said, I don't think vouchers move us in the way, the direction we want to go. That's my reason, not that it's an incremental step. My decision. Okay,
well, but then there's another point to consider then. That somebody that's calling for, let's say, a 50% cut in the income tax. What I find disconcerting a lot about the reform crowd is, oh, let's lower taxes. And I agree with you. I mean, I'd rather pay less taxes. I'd rather be subject to less regulations. I think it's good that some states are legalizing at least marijuana. But my point, or one of the points I make, is that let's not mistake that for the free society. That it's sort of like slavery in the Old South. That if you, let's say you improved the lives of the slaves, you made 8-hour days, and you let them complain about their condition. They could write letters to the editor. They could even vote. You could say, okay, slaves can vote. And they have health care, and they can stay together with their families. But from 8 to 5 every day, they've got to be out in those fields picking cotton. Well, I would say that's great. The reformers have improved the lives of the slaves. But they're not free. And I think that's what distinguishes libertarians from, let's face it, the conservatives are mostly the ones about reform. The progressives are the ones that believe in the welfare state. They believe in the paternalistic state. And so what's attractive to me about libertarianism is that this is our concept of freedom, the right to keep everything you earn, no income tax at all, and decide what to do with it, share it, invest it. And so we call for a separation of charity in the state too.
Well, the fact that someone is proposing real steps like reducing tax rates, which I would be happy about, I certainly wouldn't oppose it. That doesn't mean we would stop what we were doing. But the fact that they're doing that doesn't undercut our effort. We would still be pointing out great, now let's go all the way. So that would be how I approach it, because in my view, it's not enough just to say what the right position is. Abolish Program X for Y or Z. You could stand up on a mountaintop and shout, abolish all this stuff, and of course, it would not get you anywhere near the goal. The problem is, the problem is how do we get other people to understand that that's the right position too, so that we actually get that. We don't want to just say it, we want to get it, right? We want to achieve it, not just say it and feel good. So the question is, how do we get the people out there to agree with us, so that we actually do it?
Okay.
That's FFF's concern.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of the challenges that libertarians face, because obviously, we don't live in the kind of society that we're striving for. And what are some of the challenges? And what is it that people find difficult about libertarianism? Because one thing's certain about most Americans, I think, they honestly think they're free. And I think that's one of the big obstacles we face here. I think they are epitomized by the words of Johann Goethe, that none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they're free. And I think that's something that applies to Americans. They really believe they're free. You go to a ball game and everybody gets up, in the fourth inning or whatever and sings, "Thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free," and they praise the troops, and they really believe it. And then we libertarians come along and they say, well, what do you libertarians want to do? And we say, we want freedom. Well, they look at us like, what? I'm already free. And so I think that one of the challenges we face is talking about what it really means to be free. What does that word really mean? And why is it that we libertarians don't feel that we're free? Because if people never hear these ideas, and I think that's the other thing that you and I and other libertarians contribute, that in order for people to consider an idea, they have to hear it. So if we were all down here reforming, I think we'd be mired in the reform. It's those of us that are up here talking about ideals and principles. We plant the seeds for a great, glorious transformation in society.
Well, that's the division of labor, right? That's what I said. But regarding whether about people thinking they're free, I wouldn't go all the way with Goethe in our context, because one reason people think they're free is that they are in good measure free. My complaint is they're not free enough, but they are free to not an insubstantial extent. I mean, compare life in Cuba or North Korea, or you can pick out some other places where there are internal passports. Here, people realize they can get up in the morning and they can go out to a store and buy any book, or they can go online and buy any book, or see a website. We're not blocking websites at this point in the government, thank goodness. They can publish criticisms of war. You and I do it every day, or criticisms of the NSA. They can hold meetings like this. I'm pretty sure those doors are not going to be broken in by, a SWAT team or the CIA or the FBI and round us all up because we're talking subversive ideas here. But that's not true every place. And in the past it was. In a lot of places it was not true. So when they think they're free, they're not like whacked out. It's not like they're on drugs or something. And we think you're nuts. What do you mean you're free? To a large extent they're free. They can, to a large extent, I keep stressing a large extent, live the lives they want. Now, there are lots of limits on that, which are not always obvious, and that's part of our job, to show them they're not free enough. They're not totally free. That would then be free enough. And so that's what I think. I'll pass it over to you. My next point, I'm sure, will be appropriate.
Okay, well, I mean, you're right. I agree with you. I mean, you've got freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Nobody is forcing us to go to church on Sundays. And so it's really, I think, a higher level of freedom, or a deeper sense of what freedom means. I mean, I think people get the sense that because they're voting and they're participating in the political process, along with what you say, they go on vacation, they can do what they want on Saturday mornings, they feel they're free. I mean, if you take like religion, we don't put that up to the majority vote. And I think that's why people feel free in that sense. If the majority was going to vote on what you did on Sunday morning, I think people would recoil against that. They'd sense this is a threat to my freedom here. I think that what distinguishes us libertarians is that we want to take that principle of religious liberty and apply it to what people do with their lives generally, like in a monetary sense. Why shouldn't you be free to engage in any occupation you want? A florist, a lawyer, a doctor, without asking for official permission. Why should that be subject to majority vote on engaging in economic enterprise? Why can't it be free enterprise, free of government control? And why shouldn't I be free to keep everything I earn, the fruits of my earnings, and decide for what I'm going to do with my money? If I want to take care of my parents, great. But that's what freedom's all about, the right to say no, to be irresponsible, to be immoral, as long as your conduct is peaceful. And it's that concept of freedom that I think we have to take what people understand to be freedom in this part of their lives and apply it over here to this part of their lives. And the other aspect, and we can talk a little bit more, is on the drug war. I mean, there's a classic example where you're putting people in jail for ingesting a substance. How can that be reconciled with basic fundamental principles of freedom?
No, I think most people are walking around with a contradictory mixture of ideas, and they're behind their concept of freedom. And this was pointed out by an essay by Benjamin Constant, who was an early 19th century classical liberal economist, French, who wrote an essay which you can find online called The Liberty of the Ancients Compared with the Liberty of the Moderns. And he points out that the ancient notion of liberty in, say, the city-states in Greece, the small democracies, freedom consisted entirely of being a citizen and participating in the political process. In other words, being in the debate and being in there. They didn't vote on candidates; they voted on the actual questions, right, at issue. So freedom meant being in the debate, trying to persuade the other people to what you thought was the right position. casting your vote, but then at that point, the community has decided, and you go along with that. That's what the ancients regarded as freedom. Constant pointed out that the modern notion, I was writing in the early 19th century France, so the liberal revolutions have, the age of liberalism is coming along. He says the modern notion includes that participation in the government, so that's a part of it, but it's really only a small part of it. The bulk of it is being able to govern your own life, run your own life, the right to privacy, the right to kind of the things I just talked about, where you get to spend the day as you like, and acquire property, he said, to use the property the way you like, he even said to abuse the property. That's the modern notion of freedom. So I think people are walking around and they've never read Constant, they haven't read Rousseau, most people haven't read Aristotle's Politics or the Plato Republic or any of that stuff, but they're still what they've absorbed from education and the culture and parents and media. They've absorbed this very muddled contradictory mixture of ideas, both the ancient and modern, and it's all jumbled together. So on the one hand, they would recoil, most people, at the idea that we should vote on what the official religion will be. Most people are going to tell you, no, we certainly cannot do that. That would be wrong. Or about speech or press. On the other hand, they think that applying the ancient method regarding how some of our income is to get spent or how much of our income is to be taken, that to them is not inconsistent. To them, they see that as now they're lapsing into the ancient mindset. So we need to untangle all that stuff and show them that the modern notion regarding religion and what we think of as personal liberties, that idea is just as important in this other idea: how you spend your own money, how you save for how you create a pension. All that stuff also ought to be in the realm of personal freedom and not this participatory democracy.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that people are born in this kind of system, and they're raised in this kind of system, and they're inculcated with the notion that this is freedom. I mean, you go to public school where your parents are forced to send you, and you pledge allegiance to the flag every day with freedom and justice for all. So by the time you're 18, you're convinced you live in a free society. So, like, who's going to convince you otherwise? And so when I discovered libertarianism, I was like stunned, because I was one of those. I thought, yeah, of course I live in a free country. And all of a sudden, here are people saying, this is what freedom's really all about. Wow, it was a big opener for me, eye-opener for me. But let's talk a little bit about the pragmatic case for freedom. I grew up in the poorest city in the United States, down the border, Laredo, Texas, and so I saw poor people, and I worked with illegal aliens on our farm and stuff, and what was the real, and I grew up as a liberal, I was a Democrat, I believed that the government should be helping the poor, and then I discovered libertarianism, and I realized that all this stuff, minimum wage laws, occupational licensure laws, regulations, they're all an attack on the poor, and even income taxation. And I think that's one of the more powerful arguments that we have as libertarians, is to say, look, this is a philosophy that not only brings freedom to a society, but it brings economic prosperity, and it opens opportunities for those at the bottom of the economic ladder to make money and become wealthy.
Yeah, of course I agree with that. One of the tasks we have is to, and this is not easy, is to at least do what Leonard Read tried to do, which was spread enough basic economics around through writing and lecturing that people could at least begin to think, engage in the economic way of thinking. Because most people don't know how markets work. They don't, not only do they not know how markets work, they may not know that markets work and that government is necessary. In other words, if they take any economics, they probably had a Keynesian teacher. A lot of them don't take economics, and ones that do forget it right up to the final. So they're not thinking in the economic way. So they don't know that markets are self-operating. They don't know that. They think the idea of unplanned order, undesigned order, is not an intuitive idea. It's a counterintuitive idea. So most people are not going to think on their own. So if you just take an average person and say, government we should get rid of all government intervention, all government regulation of the economy of all kinds, most people, I believe, will say that can't work. because they've come to think that markets are like sort of machine, but that the government is turning the crank, and if the government were to basically stop turning that crank, it's all going to wind down. I don't blame them. I mean, that's all they've heard all their lives, and this stuff is not easy. I didn't think this stuff up myself. I had to read about it. Thank goodness I came in contact with writing. Someone recommended I read Henry Hazlitt or read Bosnia. I don't know where I might have been if I never met that first person. Presumably someone else would have told me, but I wouldn't think this stuff up myself. I mean, people looking out there aren't going to say, oh yeah, that could all work itself. So that's our job. We've got to teach them that stuff runs itself. There's a great line and a great paragraph in Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. It's eloquent, and this is fairly close to a verbatim. He says the great part of the order that we observe in society is not the result of government. It's the result of people understanding the benefits of mutual exchange and mutual interest in cooperation. And if the government, and he was no anarchist, but he just goes on to say if the government were to disappear tomorrow, that order would not be disturbed. And that's the liberal insight that goes way, way back before Paine. And that's what we have to find a way to communicate to people. So they're not scared by any call of abolition, the abolition of the government program. If they haven't been prepared with that idea, they're going to recoil from getting rid of Social Security, getting rid of various economic regulations, consumer protection, et cetera. So that's our task.
Yeah, I think the government inculcates its fear. I mean, even the word, the safety net. What does that connote? To me, it connotes that life is on a high wire, and there is no safety net unless the government provides that you fall off that high wire, you die. And so we've got to have the government there that if you fall off, you fall into the net like the trapeze artist, and you're safe. Well, sure, life has its risks, but, I think what we argue as libertarians is the most secure way of life is the free way of life. It's more secure for the handicapped and the poor when there's a lot of wealth in that society, because the handicapped and the poor live better lives than they do, say, in North Korea, where everybody's forced to be equal and everybody's verging on starvation. But speaking of fear, let's move into the last few minutes here into the national security state apparatus, the CIA, the NSA, that has this massive secret surveillance scheme, no longer secret, but who knows what they're still doing in secret. And the giant military empire, what President Eisenhower many years ago called the military-industrial complex, overseas bases, coups, torture, indefinite detention, regime change operations. To me, it's the same thing. I mean, most everybody here grew up in the 9/11 era, where terrorists are the big threat. Oh my gosh, we have to alter our lives because the terrorists are coming to get us. You and I had to deal with the same nonsense with communists. The communists are coming, all the Cold War nonsense. Look under your beds for a communist, and it just justifies this huge military intelligence apparatus that we call the national security state. We call it the garrison state. And it's the same principle, that if we didn't have this huge apparatus, the drug dealers, the illegal aliens, the communists, the terrorists would come and take over America. And so they got to keep us fearful. And not only that, they have to go out and provoke the very crises that they then use to take away our civil liberties, indefinite incarceration, torture of Americans, assassination of Americans. The federal judge just upheld that Friday. How can this possibly be reconciled with free society?
Well, people think it's the price of the freedoms we already talked about. They don't know history. Certainly don't know the history of U.S. Foreign intervention. And so to them, the history began on 9/11, and they had no trouble believing, most people know, that this was an out of the blue attack, because they wouldn't have been aware that the U.S. had been intervening in the Middle East for decades. And so if you don't know that, then you wonder, well, why did people come and knock down our buildings? And then people start saying, oh, it's because they don't like our freedom. We have MTV, we have Las Vegas, we have showgirls, so they had to come and knock down buildings because of that. And people buy it. If you're ignorant of history, you'll buy almost anything, it seems. So part of our job, in the economic realm, we're teaching theory with history. Here we got to teach them the history of U.S. intervention. It doesn't justify what happened on 9/11, but it helps us understand it. And of course, one way to prevent something from happening again that deep history. Again, it's not an easy job, but they have to know. Otherwise, they're going to believe this. They may be sad about the fact, but they may say, look, we have to do this stuff to protect our freedom. It's not that they think that's freedom, but they think it's the price of freedom. And we need to show them, no, it's the intervention that provokes people, and who then, get crazy and do bad things. And we don't want to. So we really, the best way to protect our freedom is not to go abroad provoking people.
Yeah, well, one of the fascinating phenomena in this area is when Ron Paul in 2008 in that campaign was in that debate with all the other candidates, and they were all talking about, they attacked us for our freedoms. And Ron Paul comes out with this statement that says, that's not true. They came over here to kill us because our government's been over there killing them. And he told me later, he says at that point he thought that was the end of his campaign. And ironically, it was the beginning of his campaign, because so many people, including young people, it seemed almost like they instinctively knew he was telling the truth. And they said, we want to know more. We want to know more. And so they started speaking out. Why was Ron Paul saying this? And so all of a sudden, huge numbers of people started gravitating to him on the foreign policy issue. And of course, you and I have been writing this. You were writing it before 9/11, where you were saying, if the U.S. keeps doing what they're doing in the Middle East, with the sanctions against Iraq, that were killing hundreds of thousands of children, plus a multitude of other things, that there's going to be terrorism on American soil. And sure enough, it happened. And one of the most fascinating historical cases is Iran, because it's the exact same principle you're talking about. They say, the history began with 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, where they took American diplomats hostage and shows how bad those people are. When you and I know that the history actually began 20 years before, when the CIA went into Iran, ousted the democratically elected prime minister, democratically appointed Mohammad Mossadegh, in a coup, a secret coup that the CIA had inspired and instigated, and put in the Shah of Iran with a brutal dictatorial rule that with the support of the CIA that lasted 20 years, and it was that rule that caused the revolution in '79. How many people know that? Because it's certainly not something that the U.S. government wants people to know.
Tend not to learn it in the government high school, and probably not much in college, unless they happen to have a professor who understands it himself and is willing to teach it. But so it's a lack of information. Given what they think they know, it's understandable that they're willing to put up with a lot of oppressive measures, because they think the alternative is chaos with dirty bombs going off or suitcase bombs going off in Manhattan. Most people will say, look, I'll take spying over that. I mean, it's the old Hobbes thing, right? Give Leviathan all the power, or else it's the war of all against all, with everybody slitting everybody's throat. Most people, if they think that's the choice, most people will say, okay, I don't like Leviathan, but it does sound better. That was Hobbes' point. It does sound better than the war of all against all. So we have to show them that's a false alternative. There's a third choice. The Leviathan is the one that causes the danger.
Right. It causes the danger in terms of that government becomes the biggest threat to your freedom, to your well-being, and that the real solution in terms of both economic prosperity and harmony and peace with the world is to dismantle not just the welfare state apparatus and the drug war apparatus, but dismantle this whole Cold War apparatus that I think should never come into existence anyway. That the worst thing is to fight communism with more totalitarianism at home. You fight communism and totalitarianism with your own principles of liberty. And to turn America into a garrison state with now we're torturing and assassinating it, this is despicable. But on that note, let's open it up now.
To go back to the foreign policy issue, obviously there's a lot we lead towards non-intervention. So how do you deal with weak states such as Somalia, Eritrea, sort of Angola, which are all sort of threatened by militant Islam or militant rebel groups? So how would you deal with that? Do you sort of let them deal with it themselves, or do you intervene deal with it? And I'm just curious to how do you sort of sacrifice
say preliminarily that questions are good, and we welcome, but also feel free to give a comment and your own perspective. We're a small enough room, we're a small enough group where we can do that. And so we learn from you guys as well, and you, Bert. Feel free to give us your perspective. We have plenty of time. Sheldon?
Well, my approach is, first of all, skeptical that the U.S. would make things better. Let's look at recent examples. The intervention in Libya led to the overthrow and death of Gaddafi, who was, interestingly brought in from the cold only a few years earlier and led to believe he was a new ally of the United States. That didn't work out so well. That led to a flow of arms, because the arms caches opened up, that were then taken to Mali by jihadis who wanted to co-opt the separatist movement north of Mali, by the group that's been trying to at least have autonomy upon total separation. So it aggravated the system. The problem is there's always the law of unintended consequences is not going to be repealed by an act of Congress or by executive order. So the chances are extremely good that U.S. intervention will mess things up. I mean, I don't see any evidence of any of the interventions that have happened recently in Iraq and Afghanistan that the people who are making policy know anything about those societies. Societies are extremely complex things. They're, old. They've been around a long time. And the idea that you can go into places you named, or Afghanistan or Iraq, and somehow turn them into liberal democracies, however you might conceive of that, is so unlikely that you're going to end up just adding to the violence, which look what we did in Iraq. What happened in Iraq since, go back to 1990 when
I think there's spreading democracy and then just sort of shoring up weak states. I mean, can, for example, the US government deal with Islamist militants in, the Gulf of Aden? You've got oil security issues there. And the other thing I was trying to point out is you're not making a decision. So if you say, I'm not doing this, you're still making a decision to support, potential rebel groups, which may be overthrowing democratic regimes.
Well, you say shore up, that usually translates into installing a friendly strongman. A dictator, a military dictator, who the people come to hate and then overthrow, and then we again regard that country as a great threat to us. And they're mad at us because we've been imposed Iran is a perfect example. We shored something up there, right? They had a left of center government in '53 that was going to nationalize oil interests, and we fixed things real good. We restored a brutal autocrat power, and in 1979 it blew up in our faces. So they don't know what they're doing. I think we have to face the fact that the people that make these policies don't know what they're doing, and it just increases the violence. Look what they did to Iraq. They destroyed that society, and this says nothing positive about Saddam Hussein. So, I don't see the model. It's very easy to say, why can't we just go in and shore up a failed state? But we know what that means in practice. I mean, look at the long history of U.S. intervention. Go back further than that, and see that, it's very easy to say, why don't we just go in there and shore up a failed state that's being threatened by jihadis? But those are just words. Look what it ends up doing. It ends up killing people. It ends up making things worse.
When I say sort of shore up, I don't necessarily mean sending the B-52s, but sending the special forces, because you're not dealing with economic. So, for example, sure,
you don't know who the aid's going. First of all, you have to take it from the taxpayer, so that's the number one objection. Number two, they never know whose hands it ends up in. I mean, look at Syria. They claim that, we're helping the liberal opposition. No, they're not. The most active opposition are jihadis. And the funny thing is, the people that were helping the Maliki government fight in Iraq are the people who were, at least de facto, backing when they're in Syria. When they cross that basically non-existent border between Iraq and Syria, they're our enemy when they're here, and they're our basically our friend, we're on the same side when they're there. I mean, this is what you're going to get. You're not going to get some sort of intervention you're imagining. Even if you could imagine it and make a good case for it, that's not what you're going to get in real life. I mean, the public choice school answers this. Go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, besides the impracticality of making sure that economic aid gets where you want it to go, or trying to see if military intervention can overthrow some autocrat, it's more the principle of the fact that, that's a really good point, I'm sort of losing it, but why is it our responsibility? Because you make it sound like it is our responsibility.
What we're just saying is, do you want a rogue state?
Well, we should defend our own borders, and if a rogue state comes for us, then we can defend against them. But it's sort of like preventative law, banning things before you even know that they're going to cause a problem.
No, I'd say that you can see they're going to cause problems for the fact that you have ethnic groups in Gambia, you have ethnic groups in Sierra Leone, Kenya,
But aren't a lot of these problems the result of earlier intervention, like British and French intervention after World War I, where they created nations just invented them by drawing lines in the sand, drawing through tribes, which then grouped into artificial nations, rival tribes that maybe didn't much like each other, so they're fighting for control of the government, and another part of the tribe is across the artificial border in some other country. I mean, the stuff you're complaining about often has its roots in intervention by the so-called enlightened, free world. The U.S. government is the rogue state. It's more rogue than any state you're thinking of in Africa, I think.
Let me weigh in. Okay, well, I'm sorry. What if we presume that U.S. military intervention in the Middle East is not simply to sort of shore up a government, as you said, against Islamic militants, but rather to sort of ensure that there's stability in the region? For example, in 1981, you were talking about when the country of Iraq was developing a nuclear reactor, ostensibly for some sort of bad purpose, probably because it was in conflict with Iran. And you mentioned the sanctions that we employed against Iran. I agree with you that they were pretty ineffective. They just murdered a whole bunch of Iraqi children. They didn't really do anything. But then in 1981, Israel bombed it, their nuclear reactor. We haven't had a problem with it since then. I was wondering if that sort of thing goes unappreciated, just a direct military strike.
Well, I can say two things about the Iraq case in particular. That reactor, above-ground reactor, was built in bombed in 1981. When it was examined later by Harvard physicists, and I just wrote about this, it was this person reported that this was designed by a French designer to not be suitable for making weapons. So there's no evidence it was for weapons at all. It wasn't suitable for making weapons. It had built-in limits. But after Israel bombed it, that's when Saddam Hussein started showing some interest in a weapons program, which would have then been underground or in a mountain, and obviously would have aggravated the situation. So that's not a very good example of what can happen with intervention. Israel didn't make things better. They bombed a power reactor, which is all around this building. If you read Gareth Porter's book, Manufactured Crisis, you'll see that there's no evidence that they've ever built anything that would lead to a nuclear weapon. It's about power and places.
What about in the case of Iran, for example?
Well, I just was...
No, as well. I mean, in the current case with Iran, with sort of strategic bombing, I mean, if you could get below the mountains, let's say. Yeah,
but they're not building any weapons. There's no evidence that they have any interest in building weapons. In fact, the 16 U.S. intelligence agencies have twice issued a national intelligence estimate, 2007, 2011, saying that Iran hasn't shown any interest in a weapon since 2003. That was the same year that the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein. They have not built or bought anything that would be suitable for weapons.
So haven't they enriched uranium past the potency for peaceful purposes?
No. The highest they've gone, which by the way in the interim agreement they're not doing anymore, was under 20%, and that's for medical isotopes.
But this is the same sort of argument that people were using when we were dealing with North Korea. The same person who's in charge of diplomatic relations with with Iran was the same woman who was in charge of making sure North Korea didn't obtain nuclear capabilities, and they did in the 1990s.
There's a big difference. Both countries were signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That when you're a signer of the treaty, you were routinely inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Before North Korea built its bomb, it quit the treaty and threw out the inspectors. Iran is still an active signer of a party to that agreement, is routinely inspected, and the IAEA repeatedly reports that every speck of uranium is accounted for and has not been diverted to weapons purposes. If you look at Gareth Ford's book, he lays it out, all that stuff very, very clearly. You'll see that they have not made a move. Even the Mossad tells Netanyahu that that Iran has never made a decision to build a nuclear
But under
weapon.
a non-interventionist military policy, how would feasibly we have prevented the North Koreans from developing nuclear weapons?
Well, the U.S. government certainly didn't. So, right?
So no, I agree, but I'm just saying.
Well, it wouldn't. But we also wouldn't threaten North Korea. A non-intervention system would make it clear that we have no desire to attack North Korea.
So it was inevitable, is what you're saying.
No.
It was inevitable that the North Koreans would get nuclear
Well,
weapons.
no, let me weigh in here. It's entirely rational for the North Koreans to develop a nuclear weapon because that's the only thing that's going to deter the United States from going in with a regime change operation. We got to keep in mind that this is the whole goal of the national security state, regime change operations. It's designed to put in a pro-U.S. dictator in power, and that'll do what they're told. I mean, you look what's happening in Egypt. They oust the democratically elected president of the country. This is a military dictatorship that the U.S. government built. They love what's going on over there. This is order and stability. This is what we're talking about. Order and stability. They did the same thing in Chile. They oust the democratically elected president there to put in a military general.
Nicaragua too.
Huh?
Nicaragua too.
Nicaragua too, Guatemala too. They oust democratic regimes. It's not just they're ousting autocratic regimes, they're ousting democratic regimes to put their man into
Well,
power.
I certainly agree, but I'm just wondering that to assume then that the U.S. doesn't exert influence over other countries is not to assume then that other countries don't. China influences North Korea.
Yes, and yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that I think we can probably consider China to be something of a geopolitical threat.
How so?
Why?
Why is that a threat?
Because consistently they've threatened democratic nations. China itself is probably the epitome of a non-democratic nation, a barbaric nation to be sure.
But how does it threaten us? In fact, economically, of course, it's been liberalizing. How's that a threat to the United States?
I would consider that a threat to our allies is a direct threat to us. Like Japan, for example, North Korea is consistently firing missiles over their homeland. We for some reason made them demilitarize after the Second World War, and we don't protect them anyway. So they don't have an army, and then the North Koreans are shooting missiles. They're kidnapping their soldiers too.
Well, I would say that's for them to work out. I don't see how we make it better by globalizing the conflict.
Well, in any case, I think in any event we make it worse because we haven't allowed the Japanese to militarize them.
Well, that's interventionist too. We shouldn't be telling Japan what to do.
No,
I'm going to weigh on the point you made, though, because I think that's really the fundamental question is, and it addresses sort of all this, is should this be the role of the U.S. government to serve as the world's policeman here? And is this what we want, and is this going to mean a free society at home? I think that's the initial question. Can you reconcile an interventionist foreign policy with freedom at home? And if you can't, then is it worth it to you? Is it worth it to you to live in an unfree society so that you can have a government that's policing the world? Now, John Quincy Adams gave a great speech, highly recommended, it's on the internet, called In Search of Monsters to Destroy. He gives the case for the non-interventionists. He says this is not the role of the American government. This is not what our ancestors call this government into existence for. That there are lots of bad things that happen in the world. There are dictatorships, there are terrorists, there are conflicts, there are battles, lots of bad things. He called them monsters, starvation. But he says, this government will not go abroad to save you. We will not go abroad to help you. But know that there is one nation, if you want to get out of your oppression, your tyranny, your starvation, there is one nation you can go to, no questions asked, because we're going to have an open immigration policy. And that was the way you help people. It's not the only way. Second way is that if you feel the responsibility to go help people that are suffering in these lands, you go. You take responsibility for it. I don't feel responsible for what's happening in Somalia. I'm not going to go over there and give my life. I feel bad that they're involved in a civil war or whatever, but you go, or you want to raise money to go. And so any private citizen should be free to go abroad and help people suffering tyranny and so forth. But leave the government here and lead the world with a free society. That's the best thing we can ever do. Than what Sheldon points out, all you're doing is making messes after messes. You're making things worse. You're pouring gasoline on a fire that already exists. All right, let me call on him, and then you can go. Yeah, and you have to weigh in, too. We use force here. That's free.
Yeah, and free speech.
I'm just kidding.
It's funny you say John Quincy Adams, because he was the president right after James Monroe, and Monroe obviously issued the Monroe Doctrine.
He was the Secretary of State under Monroe.
Yeah, there you go. I think he wrote most of it. But you even look a couple years before that with George Washington was giving his farewell address, and this we all know, he said to avoid political parties and to avoid foreign entanglements, to stay neutral and isolated. And I find it funny because I think for, besides the War of 1812, for roughly 100 years, we were pretty good in terms of foreign policy and not intervening with other places. And then, Teddy Roosevelt comes in, and then he adds the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And then 10, 15 years after that, World War I happens, and next thing you know, we're involved with the rest of the world. And then, I'm a history major, so I'm going through history right now. But then you then go through World War II, and then after that, the U.S. emerges as this dominant military and economic power, which then leads them to play the game which missile is bigger with the USSR for the remainder of the Cold War. And, we really screwed ourselves up, I think, at that point, because we got involved with the rest of the world, which is something George Washington warned us against. So I wonder if, you look back through our history, would George Washington, John Quincy Adams, they look at that and be pissed off at us. You went against what this country was kind of wanting to be, a place that encouraged freedom and like a free society that wasn't intervening with the rest of the world.
I have to inject a little bit of revisionism here.
Sure. I'm a Euro concentrated.
Yeah, I think the entangling alliances, I think that's actually Jefferson's phrase. I think what Washington says is commercial relations with other countries and as little political relations as possible. He doesn't call for isolation. What the Americans of the American rulers of those days had in mind was freedom of action. In other words, don't get tied down by alliances. It wasn't a call for non-intervention. Because, they had been allies with France, and then they weren't allies with France, and then they were allies with France again. And if you're tied down by an alliance, there are things you might want to do that you can't do. So that's what he was warning against. And to say with Jefferson, because if you just look at how they actually acted when they were in power, it doesn't really bear out on isolationism. Now let's move to Monroe and Quincy Adams. The Monroe Doctrine said to the British, no further colonization in our hemisphere. They had design on the whole hemisphere. They certainly wanted Canada, they wanted Mexico, they wanted all the way to the Pacific, and that was the gateway to Europe, to Asia, including China and the Hawaiian Islands. And they said, we'll stay out of Europe. So that was written by Quincy Adams. But they didn't stay out of Europe. Monroe gets involved in a civil war in Greece. Why? Because it was a revolution. It was supposed to be a revolution that was like the American Revolution, and they meddled with it. So it didn't exactly do. Their words were better than their deeds. I think they were empire builders from the start. They wanted the entire continent, and by that I mean Mexico and Canada too. And then they had their eyes on the whole hemisphere, and they were expansionists. I mean, Washington and look what Jefferson does. Yeah. Jefferson, who was the better among them, once he gets in office, he buys Louisiana, which is
a point where he contradicts his own philosophy because he was a strict constructionist, but but and
We
you
were
know,
just
when,
talking
yeah,
about
we were just talking about this earlier.
before this.
It's like Jefferson, he was into strict interpretation of the Constitution. And then he goes abroad to Napoleon. Napoleon offers him Louisiana Purchase for $15 million or whatever. And what Jefferson should have done, according to his philosophy, was gone back to Congress and said, hey, you need to approve this. The problem is that would have taken months. And
No,
by
he knew he needed a constitutional amendment. He knew it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, but then he went against it and agreed to it.
Look, they would have made war in France to get it. They would have made war in Spain to get what were known as the Floridas, which was much more than what we think of as Florida.
Right.
Thing there went way into past almost to Texas, right, and a lot of land. They were expansionists, and they destroyed nations in order to expand. They were called Indian nations.
Mm-hmm.
They cleared the land of Indians, and not in a nice way.
And then Mexican-American War,
So I see much more continuity in American history. I think they always had empire on their mind. Now, it was an empire, they called it an empire of liberty, and they wanted a good measure of domestic liberty, personal liberty. So I'm not saying they wanted to regulate your every movement in life. They weren't totalitarians, but they had empire from the beginning on their mind, and I think other American rulers ever since have had that same attitude. It's an American exceptionalism, which we're talking about today, right? We're the indispensable nation. And when you believe you're the exception, then you feel threatened because you're the only one. So now you have to make sure other people are seeing things your way, or else they're a threat to you. And they talked about conquering these, annexing these other territories as a matter of national security. They use the word security. They might not put the word national in front of it, but that's what they want.
I guess this was a note on the international matter, but the U.S. matter is still very important. That we can only ever really guarantee today we might not say we guarantee it, but we can only strive to guarantee our liberty here abroad, because this is what we have control over. And it's funny because in Keynesian economics, they sort of hate the idea of imports because our government can only control our economy and not other economies. So when we import a lot, we're subject to the whims of other countries. But that applies to foreign policy as well, because if we can only secure our freedom here and not anywhere else, then the best we can do for liberty and prosperity for the rest of the world, and not as an obligation, but just sort of built into our principles as a nation, is tell people that they can come here if they would like to experience these things, but we're not going to try and go around the world and force it on everyone else, because one, it probably won't work as we've seen, and two, it's not our obligation.
That's my sentiment, and then not to mention what it's done to us. I mean, when I was a kid, the last thing I ever thought of was that we would be torturing people. I mean, it was like medieval stuff. You look on the internet, you see those old torture things in Italy and Spain and stuff, and here's my own government, and it's like a legitimate position. It's like, I'm just flabbergasted that not everyone is horrified by the fact that this is a nation, it's a torture nation. We lead the world in torture and assassinations. I mean, there was a time when we recoiled at the idea of assassination. That's our official policy now. And a federal judge last Friday said it's okay for them to assassinate Americans. They don't have to answer to anybody. Federal judge threw the case out. It's the Anwar al-Awlaki case. That's phenomenal to me. And so that's the cost that if you favor all this interventionism, it comes with a price. And because I don't see how you can reconcile a free society with a government that's got the power to assassinate you and torture you and detain you under military rule in a concentration camp and call that freedom.
Yes, to bring you back to the 21st century. So let's talk about regime change operations. Clearly, regimes such as North Korea are going to fall. So if you're non-interventionist,
Are going to what?
Regimes such as North Korea, are they going to fall eventually? You're going to see they'll just collapse in on themselves as soon as they stop moving along. So how do you deal as a non-interventionist with the humanitarian crisis that is going to be pushed on allies in South Korea, Japan, to a certain extent China, and what do you do with this whole Tulsa clan with nuclear weapons.
I get back to my point is that North Korea is none of my business, and this is a civil war. This is not two independent nations. This is a civil war, and part of the reason that the country is divided is because of the U.S. And all the troops, the U.S. troops that died in Korea died for nothing, just like the 58,000 troops who died in Vietnam died for nothing. We were all told that the communists were going to fall. I mean, the dominoes were going to fall. The communists were coming to get us. It wouldn't have made any difference if North Korea had taken over the South any more than it made any difference for North Vietnam to take over the South. The dominoes didn't fall. The communists didn't come and take over our country. But I repeat, if you feel the obligation, you say, my gosh, I don't like this, that North Koreans are bad people and they've got a bad regime, and I'm going to go over there and I'm going to fight for the South if war breaks out. Great. I would encourage you to do that. Just don't get the government involved and don't force me to go with you.
I mean, I'm not saying you haven't answered my question. I think we're looking at it too historically. I'm just saying, what do we do when you have people, first of all, you don't know who they are, controlling nuclear weapons? And what message does that send out to allies such as Japan, South Korea, that, we ain't coming to heaven?
What do you mean by we?
Well, the American government, NATO, and whoever else wishes to partake.
Nothing. It does nothing. Just like the Swiss government. It does exactly what the Swiss government does.
We shouldn't be aligned to begin with.
No, I mean, I'm not debating, whether you have to be in the alliance. I'm just saying, how do you, deal with, first of all, humanitarian crisis as a, they just say, not my problem.
What do you mean humanitarian?
I think generally you mean leaving nuclear weapons in what is essentially a power vacuum.
Yeah, I mean, because you can't have nuclear weapons in a power.
What does that mean?
You're saying that the government of North Korea would fall, and that they have nuclear weapons would come into possession of somebody more radical, or,
What could be worse than a communist dictator?
Kim Jong-un. You think there's somebody worse than that?
Can you imagine anybody worse than
I think we have to make something really clear. Libertarians don't promise that if the U.S. goes libertarian, everything in the world is then sweetness and light. There was a hit song from 1970, which some people in this room might remember. I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. We are not promising utopia, but we're saying at least the U.S. government won't be making things worse. I mean, if you look at the unintended consequences of past interventions, even World War II, World War I, they're horrendous. Why would you have any confidence in good consequences coming out of U.S. intervention in some place like the Far East or Southeast Asia or Africa? I mean, just look at the record. And this is something Brian Kaplan, the George Mason University, has been so good at. It's always easy after the fact or before the fact to say, oh no, we can intervene there clean and simple and it'll be quick. Remember what did Curry say about Syria? It's going to be an unbelievably small strike. I mean, there's something to say about the launch of cruise missiles. Luckily, they never did it. But so it's easy looking at it prospectively. Say, oh no, it'll be nice and clean. Look at the consequences of past interventions, and that should not give you any confidence in the next one.
Let me make one more point about you guys here. It's easy to say the government should do these things. You're what, 19, 20 years old? Let me tell you what they were doing to 19 and 20-year-olds when I was your age. I was at Virginia Military Institute, and I saw my schoolmates dying for nothing. And if you think that you can't be, you live normal lives right now, nice pleasant lives, go down to the pub, all that can end in a minute. Because I know every one of you has to register for the draft. And don't make any mistakes about it. These brutal people in Washington wouldn't hesitate to conscript you and send you off to some rice paddy in North Korea. Because they already did that. And they did it in Vietnam, and they will do it again. If they get in a war with Russia, if it's not nuclear and it turns out only conventional, you're going to be there. And you think of me, and you think of him. When you're done